Hello friends, in this video we are going to talk about the energy sources for muscle contraction. Now there are two sources of energy for muscle contraction available in case of muscle fibers. One is the ATP or adenosine triphosphate and second is a phosphogen called as creatine phosphate. Now during muscle contraction, the ATP or adenosine triphosphate is hydrolyzed in presence of water and enzyme into ADP and inorganic phosphate. So ATP in presence of water and an enzyme which is called as myosin ATPase is converted into ADP or adenosine diphosphate and inorganic phosphate plus some amount of energy is liberated, and the amount of energy that is liberated is equal to 8.15 kilocalories. Now this energy is used during muscle contraction. Now the amount of ATP present in a muscle fiber is very small. For example, a muscle fiber has only some 2 to 4 millimoles of ATP. So this ATP gets hydrolyzed quite soon. Therefore, because the amount is less, therefore it will be exhausted very soon. Therefore, the muscle resorts to its next source of energy for muscle contraction, that is creatine phosphate. Now, creatine phosphate is actually a phosphogen. Now, this creatine phosphate is formed of two molecules. One is the creatine, and as far as this creatine is concerned, creatine is actually a tripeptide which is formed of 3 amino acids. Now the 3 amino acids that form creatine include glycine, number 1, and the arginine, number 2, and third amino acid is the methionine. These 3 amino acids will form creatine, and when creatine is associated with the second molecule, that is the phosphate, it forms the creatine phosphate. So once the cell exhausts its ATP resource, then creatine phosphate helps in the synthesis of ATP. Now how is this formed? It is as follows. So creatine phosphate in presence of the ADP or adenosine diphosphate and an enzyme called as phosphokinase. So in presence of an enzyme phosphokinase, creatine phosphate will result in formation of creatine and ATP. So it will result in formation of creatine and ATP. Now this ATP is again used during muscle contraction, and once the muscle exhausts its all creatine phosphate, then the further ATP comes from the hydrolysis, then comes from the aerobic respiration. So during aerobic respiration, a myocyte or a muscle fiber will form and normal aerobic respiration. During normal aerobic respiration, from a single molecule of glucose, some ATP 36 to 38 ATP molecules will be generated. So one molecule of glucose results in the formation of 36 to 38 ATP molecules. Now these ATP molecules are generated during normal glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. But once if the consumption of ATP is more than its formation, then at that time muscle will resort to anaerobic respiration. So muscles will resort to anaerobic respiration when the rate of expenditure of the ATP is higher than its synthesis. Now during anaerobic respiration, there is formation of lactic acid. So it comes with a price. that during anaerobic respiration, lactic acid is formed. Now, some of the lactic acid remains accumulated in the muscle fibers, but most of the lactic acid is then removed. The lactic acid that remains in the muscles results in the muscle fatigue. So, accumulated lactic acid in muscle fibers, it causes the muscle fatigue. Now, as far as the lactic acid is concerned, most of the lactic acid, however, later on when muscle is in rest, when muscle stops contracting, then at that time this lactic acid is carried by the blood and it is transferred to the liver. So, lactic acid in the blood will reach to the liver, where it will be converted back into glycogen, some of it at least. So, a part of the lactic acid now that has reached the liver, this will be first a part of it, that is 4/5 or sorry, it is actually the 1/5 part, or 20% of lactic acid is converted into water and the carbon dioxide. So, I have written here 4/5, I am sorry, it is actually here 1/5 or the 20%. Now, the remaining 80% or the 4/5 of the lactic acid, that is first converted back into pyruvic acid or pyruvate, and then that pyruvate is converted back into the glucose, and then that glucose will be stored into either glycogen in the liver, or the glucose will be liberated in the blood, and then that blood will carry it back to the muscles. So, this cycle here that occurs between the muscle and this liver, this is called as a Cori cycle. So, we have seen that this lactic acid is regenerated back into glucose. Now, what happens to the creatine? Now, during rest, all the resources of the muscle are replenished, including the creatine phosphate. So, the creatine that was formed during the muscle contraction, while the muscle is resting or during the resting muscle, this creatine phosphate will be replenished when with the help of the ATP. So, creatine plus ATP, when the muscle is resting, this will be converted back into creatine phosphate. So, that will be then stored in the muscle fiber. Now, it should be, however, remembered that all of the creatine is not converted back into creatine phosphate. Some of the creatine gets converted into, it is anhydride and it is lost as the creatinine. So, creatinine is actually an anhydride of the creatine. The same is excreted along with the urine. So, we pass out this creatinine along with our urine. This is actually an excretory waste, but the most of the creatine is converted into creatine phosphate, which is an energy source for muscle contraction. So, in this short video, we have talked about the energy sources of the muscle. So, during muscle contraction, these energy sources will be utilized, but when muscles are resting, these will be replenished. Thank you. See you in